Maiano, and welcome back. This is the AM show on Toru 3 Magic Talk and online. It has just gone 16 minutes away from 9. Are you a first home buyer? Well, good news for you. Looks like if there's anything good to come out of this pandemic, it's looking like it's going to be a better market for you. Debbie Roberts from Property Apprentice is with us now to tell us why. Morena, Debbie.
Morena, how are you?
We're just recovering. I know we're behaving like children, Debbie, but we're keen to hear from you, and we're keen to hear about the advice for first home buyers at the moment.
Excellent. Yeah. So one of the things that we've been concerned about for years now is how often we keep getting told that it's impossible for first home buyers to get their foot on the ladder and how they're getting priced out of the market. So one of the things that worries us is that first home buyers are actually going to start believing that, and instead of working towards getting their foot on the ladder, they're going to just give up. So the alternative to giving, if you're not going to buy a home, the alternative is you're going to be renting for the rest of your life, and that's not going to be fun, right? Especially with rents on the increase. So I've got some good news for those of you that are first home buyers. And that is that first home buyers currently make up the largest percentage of purchases in the market at 26.3%. The next closest is movers. So that's homeowners that are moving into another home. So, quite clearly it's not impossible to get your foot on the ladder. We've got first home buyer clients that are doing it every week, So the next thing, we hear that Reserve Bank's looking at reducing the percentage of owner-occupiers who can borrow above 80% to buy a home. You used to be able to get lending above 80%. The banks were allowed to lend 20% of their total lending, but now it could potentially change to 10% of their total lending to people who needed to borrow more than 80%. So again, it sounds like it's getting harder, but I've got some good news for you on that front as well. We've recently seen headlines that say 38% of all first home buyer lending is done with less than 20% deposit, which sounds really bad, but flip it around the other way. 62% of all first home buyer lending is done to buyers with at least 20% deposit. Okay, so if you've got a 20% deposit, you're about to see less competition from other first home buyers who are just going to give up. So it's like Christmas is going to come early for you guys, okay? Now, also, it's important to remember that Reserve Bank restrictions aren't a permanent thing, so don't just go and spend your savings on a car or something like that. If you're trying to get your foot on the ladder, keep working at it. New builds are exempt from the Reserve Bank restrictions. And potentially there's more opportunities at lower price points with existing properties anyway. But more good news, this is like a whole segment for Amanda. The first home loan scheme is also exempt from the Reserve Bank restrictions. So if you meet the terms for the first home loan scheme, you could borrow up to 95%, although you'll be limited by price caps in different regions.
Brilliant. Debbie.
And more good news.
Oh,
there's more.
Gosh, it doesn't stop.
I know.
It's like a vegan farting, isn't it?
Non-bank lenders aren't bound by the Reserve Bank restrictions either. So get in touch with a good mortgage advisor. They can help direct you into the right area for you.
Debbie, this is such good advice, and I know people at home who are looking to buy their first home will be heartened by much of what you've just had to say. Thank you so much for joining us, as always. Debbie Roberts from Property Apprentice this morning.